The fog hung thick over the English countryside on that November morning in 1944, a dense gray blanket that turned familiar landscapes into alien territory. Ground crew at an RAF base in Belgium waited for the return of American bombers from their mission over Germany, listening for the distinctive rumble of B-17 engines cutting through the mist. What they heard instead would become one of World War II's most enduring mysteries, a story that would be whispered in officers' clubs and airfields for decades to come. A lone flying fortress emerged from the clouds, its approach steady and controlled, landing gear down, flaps properly configured for landing. Everything about its descent suggested a routine return from combat. But as the massive bomber touched down on the runway with barely a bounce and rolled to a stop, something was terribly, impossibly wrong. The propellers continued their rhythmic spin, the engines hummed their familiar song, but no one emerged from the aircraft. No pilot climbed down from the cockpit. No crew members appeared at the waist gun positions. The ground personnel, initially relieved at the safe landing, felt the relief curdle into something darker as the seconds stretched into minutes with no signs of life from the stationary bomber. When the first mechanics reached the B-17 and pulled open the crew door, they discovered something that defied every law of aviation they knew. The interior of the aircraft was empty, not just empty, but hauntingly, meticulously arranged as if the crew had simply vanished mid-flight. Coffee cups sat half full in their holders, still warm to the touch. Maps were spread across the navigator's table, plotting coordinates that would never be completed. Ammunition belts fed into machine guns that no hands would fire. The pilot's seat showed the impression of where someone had been sitting, the parachute pack laid carefully to the side. In the radio compartment, a message sat half-typed on the wireless operator's desk, its final words trailing off into silence. The aircraft's fuel tanks held enough aviation gasoline for several more hours of flight. The engines, still running when ground crew reached the plane, showed no signs of damage or mechanical failure. Every gauge on the instrument panel read normal. Every system functioned exactly as designed. The base commander ordered an immediate investigation, though what exactly they were investigating seemed impossible to define. How does a four-engine bomber, one of the most complex machines of war ever built, fly itself back from enemy territory? How does it navigate through weather, descend to the proper altitude, lower its landing gear at precisely the right moment, and touch down on a runway without a single human hand on the controls? These were questions that belonged in the realm of ghost stories, not military operations. Yet here sat the physical evidence, a 30-ton aircraft that had done exactly that. The initial inspection team moved through the bomber with a mixture of professional discipline and visceral unease, documenting everything they found and, more significantly, everything they didn't find. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no bullet holes in the fuselage beyond the expected combat damage from flak. The oxygen system functioned normally, ruling out hypoxia-induced abandonment. The radio equipment worked perfectly, though no distress calls had been received. Investigation teams spent days examining every rivet and wire of the ghost bomber, searching for some rational explanation that would make the impossible possible. They interviewed dozens of personnel who had been at the airfield that morning, trying to establish a timeline of events. Weather reports were pulled and analyzed. Radar tracks were examined. Communications logs were reviewed line by line, searching for any transmission that might explain what had happened to the crew. The bomber's maintenance record showed it had been in excellent condition before the mission, recently overhauled with no recurring mechanical issues. Its combat history revealed a reliable aircraft that had completed numerous missions over occupied Europe. The crew assigned to it that day were experienced airmen, not green replacements prone to panic or poor judgment. These were men who had faced German fighters and flak batteries dozens of times, who knew their aircraft better than they knew their own homes. Theories emerged almost immediately, each more unsettling than the last. Some suggested the crew had bailed out over enemy territory after sustaining damage, but if so, why was the aircraft undamaged? Why were parachute packs still aboard? Others proposed that the crew had been incapacitated by carbon monoxide poisoning and somehow fallen from the aircraft. But the oxygen masks hung unused, and the bomber's configuration made it impossible for 10 men to simply fall out without leaving some evidence of catastrophe. A few whispered about German secret weapons, some kind of invisible gas or ray that could render a crew unconscious or dead without leaving a trace. But chemical analysis of the air inside the bomber revealed nothing unusual. The most disturbing theory suggested the crew had been teleported away by some unknown force, an explanation so far-fetched that those who voiced it were quickly dismissed. The practical mysteries were almost as profound as the metaphysical ones. For the B-17 to land itself, dozens of things had to happen in perfect sequence. The autopilot system of a 1944 bomber was primitive by modern standards, capable of maintaining altitude and heading but nothing approaching the complexity required for landing. Someone or something had to reduce throttle at exactly the right moments during descent. The landing gear lever had to be moved to the down position. The flaps had to be extended in stages as airspeed decreased. The final approach had to be aligned with the runway, requiring continuous small adjustments to heading and altitude. In the final seconds before touchdown, the throttles had to be reduced to idle and the control yoke pulled back at precisely the right moment to flare the aircraft for landing. Each of these actions required human judgment and intervention, yet the evidence insisted that no human had been aboard to perform them. Some investigators latched onto the autopilot theory despite its glaring inadequacies, suggesting that perhaps the system had malfunctioned in a way that made it far more capable than designed. But engineers who examined the autopilot hardware found it in standard configuration, incapable of the sophisticated maneuvers required for landing. Others suggested that the bomber hadn't actually landed itself at all, that perhaps a lone crew member, injured or dying, had managed to bring the aircraft down before succumbing to his wounds and somehow falling from the plane after landing. But this theory collapsed under scrutiny. Where was the body? Why was there no blood? No sign of injury anywhere in the aircraft? How could a dying man execute a textbook perfect landing that experienced pilots sometimes struggled to achieve in ideal conditions? The fog of war often obscures the truth of events. The Phantom Fortress, as it came to be known, was hardly the only mystery generated by the air war over Europe. Aircraft vanished without explanation. Crews reported impossible sightings. The strain of combat could make men see things that weren't there or fail to see things that were. But the ghost bomber was different because it left physical evidence that couldn't be explained away by stress or misidentification. It sat on the tarmac, real and solid, its silent testimony impossible to ignore or rationalize. As weeks passed with no resolution, the investigation gradually wound down. The bomber was eventually returned to service, reassigned to another crew who flew it with a mixture of pride and trepidation. Some airmen considered it lucky, a plane that had cheated death so thoroughly it must carry some protective charm. Others refused to fly in it, convinced that whatever had taken its crew might return for theirs. The aircraft completed several more missions before the war's end, performing flawlessly, showing no sign of the mystery that had made it famous in certain circles. After the war, it was among the thousands of B-17s scrapped or sold for parts, its unique history forgotten by all but a handful of aging veterans and aviation historians who continued to puzzle over its story. The fate of the original crew remains unknown to this day. They were listed as missing in action, their names eventually added to the walls of the missing at military cemeteries in Europe. No remains were ever recovered. No German records mention their capture. None of the men were ever seen or heard from again after their bomber took off that November morning. Their families received the standard letters of condolence, sanitized accounts that mentioned nothing of the impossible circumstances of their disappearance. For decades, the official story remained that they had been lost in combat, just 10 more names among the thousands who never came home. But those who were there that morning never forgot. In the years after the war, some of the ground crew who first approached the empty bomber gave interviews to aviation magazines, their stories remarkably consistent despite the passage of time. They described the eerie perfection of the landing, the way the aircraft had seemed almost alive as it touched down. They talked about the coffee that was still warm and the half-eaten sandwich they found in the bombardier's compartment. They remembered the cold that seemed to radiate from the interior of the plane, a chill that had nothing to do with November weather. Some admitted they had nightmares for years afterward, dreams of empty aircraft landing themselves over and over, their crews erased by some force beyond understanding. Modern investigators have attempted to solve the Phantom Fortress mystery using contemporary analytical techniques. They face the fundamental problem that the aircraft no longer exists for examination, and the original documentation is incomplete at best. Some researchers suggest the entire story is apocryphal, a legend that grew in the telling, wartime rumors transformed into seeming fact through repetition. They point to the lack of official records specifically documenting the incident, though this absence proves little given the chaos of wartime record keeping and the military's tendency to suppress stories that might harm morale. Other researchers have found what they believe to be corroborating evidence in mission logs and personal diaries of airmen stationed at various bases in late 1944, references to a ghost bomber that landed with no crew aboard. The most scientifically minded investigators have proposed scenarios involving unusual weather phenomena or psychological mass hallucination, though these explanations satisfy almost no one familiar with the case details. Weather alone cannot explain how an aircraft executed a complex landing sequence. Mass hallucination cannot account for the physical presence of an empty bomber sitting on a runway. Some have suggested the crew might have been victims of a top-secret German weapon that was never used again or documented, but German records captured after the war reveal no such technology. The Nazis certainly pursued exotic weapons research, but nothing in the archival evidence suggests they had developed anything capable of removing a bomber crew without damaging the aircraft. Aviation experts have studied the flight characteristics of the B-17 extensively, trying to determine if there's any way the aircraft could have flown itself under the specific conditions reported that day. The Flying Fortress was known for its stability, designed to hold course and altitude with minimal pilot input, part of what made it an effective bombing platform. In theory, if properly trimmed, a B-17 could fly straight and level for an extended period with no one at the controls. But flying straight and level is vastly different from navigating back to base, descending through clouds, finding the correct airfield, and executing a landing. These tasks require hundreds of control inputs based on visual references and instrument readings. They require decision-making that no mechanical system of the 1940s could accomplish. The psychological impact of the Phantom Fortress incident extended far beyond those directly involved. When rumors of the ghost bomber spread through the 8th Air Force, they touched on the deep anxieties that all airmen carried with them on every mission. Flying in World War II was extraordinarily dangerous, with bomber crews facing some of the highest casualty rates of any military occupation. Men watched their friends' aircraft explode or spiral down in flames. They knew that every mission might be their last, that death could come without warning from flak or fighters. In this context, the story of a crew that simply vanished, erased so completely that even their bomber didn't know they were gone, represented a special kind of horror. It suggested that the universe itself might be hostile in ways beyond enemy action, that the laws of reality could suspend themselves without warning. Some airmen began performing superstitious rituals before missions, prayers, and gestures meant to anchor them to the physical world, to ensure they wouldn't disappear like the Phantom Fortress crew. Others refused to discuss the incident at all, treating it as a jinx that might spread if spoken about too freely. The psychological toll of strategic bombing was already severe, with combat stress and battle fatigue claiming men who never took a single piece of shrapnel. The ghost bomber story added another layer of existential dread to an already nightmarish situation. The suggestion that the dangers of combat extended beyond the merely physical into realms that couldn't be fought with guns or armor. In the decades since the war, the Phantom Fortress has taken on a life of its own in aviation folklore, joining other legendary ghost planes and mysterious disappearances in the mythology of flight. Each retelling adds new details or emphasizes different aspects of the story, making it increasingly difficult to separate fact from embellishment. Some versions include specific names and dates, while others remain deliberately vague, as if the mystery itself is more important than the historical specifics. The story has appeared in books about unsolved mysteries, paranormal investigations, and military history, each author bringing their own perspective and theories to the inexplicable events of that November day. What makes the Phantom Fortress story particularly compelling is that it sits at the intersection of documented history and the impossible. We know that B-17s flew combat missions over Europe in 1944. We know that aircraft sometimes returned with partial or missing crews due to combat damage. DOMPA damage. We know that the fog of war created countless mysteries and unexplained incidents. But we also know, or think we know, that multi-ton aircraft cannot land themselves through 1940s technology. We know that 10 men cannot simply vanish from a sealed flying machine without leaving traces of how or why. The story asks us to accept that something happened which our understanding of physics and aviation insists cannot happen. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire mystery is how normal everything appeared. This wasn't a bomber riddled with bullet holes or trailing smoke. It wasn't a crippled aircraft barely making it home on one engine. It was a perfectly functional B-17, every system operational, recently maintained in excellent condition. The crew's last action suggested no awareness of impending disaster. The coffee cups and half-eaten food indicated men going about their normal routine mid-flight. Whatever happened to them happened suddenly and completely, with no time for radio calls or emergency procedures. One moment they were there, and the next they weren't, as if someone had reached into the bomber and simply removed them from existence. The families of the missing crew members faced a particularly cruel fate, denied even the closure of knowing how their loved ones died. Unlike the families of men killed in documented combat action, they had no narrative of heroism or sacrifice to cling to, no clear accounting of final moments. Instead, they had only questions that would never be answered, and a mystery that grew stranger with each year that passed without resolution. In Kirke, some family members spent years searching for information, writing letters to military officials and fellow airmen, trying to piece together what had happened. They found only dead ends and contradictory rumors, the official records offering no more insight than the speculation of strangers. As the last veterans of World War II pass away, taking their memories with them, the Phantom Fortress incident recedes further into legend. What eyewitnesses remain are fewer each year, their recollections dimmed by age and the passage of 3/4 of a century. The physical evidence is long gone, scrapped from metal in the post-war years. The official documents, if they ever existed in detail, have been lost or destroyed. What remains is the story itself, passed down through generations of aviation enthusiasts and military historians, a reminder that even in our age of science and reason, some mysteries resist explanation. The ghost plane that landed itself remains one of World War II's most haunting enigmas, a testament to the strange and terrible things that happened in the skies over Europe during humanity's most devastating conflict.